Oh, okay, good. Okay. Thanks. All right, Steve. The hour has come. Okay, boys and girls. Let's take our places with bright shining faces. It's 9. The hour has come. And it's chilly outside. Okay. Last week we finished up a lengthy discussion of the 4th commandment. Today we're going to move on to the 5th commandment. Now, I talked before about how the commandments, it's a little bit arbitrary in that the way the commandments are listed in Exodus don't necessarily represent what it is that we're going to be talking about. So the 5th commandment says, you shall not murder. So that sounds like what we would be talking about is murdering. But as we spoke of previously, the particular commandment, the specific thing that is prohibited or commanded, is actually not meant to encapsulate the whole range of what we're talking about, but only a specific incident which particularly demonstrates either what would be absolutely the opposite of what this commandment is about, or the pinnacle of it. Okay, so when we're talking about murdering, we would consider murder to be the absolute opposite of what this commandment is really commanding. And that is, it is commanding that we value human life and act accordingly. Murdering is the exact opposite of valuing human life. And so it gets the sort of chapter heading, but the contents of the chapter are all those things that relate to human life. So we begin with that idea, and then the commandment, of course, itself is, "You shall not murder." And then the catechism, the small catechism, "We should fear and love God so that we not hurt or harm our neighbor in his body, but help and support him in every physical need." It's a very simple sentence, but very broad. Okay, so it's not just that you don't murder, it says you don't hurt or harm. And it's not just that you don't hurt or harm, it's that you do help and support. And what's underneath all of this is the idea of the sanctity of life. And that's what we want to talk about first and foremost, because if we're going to talk about what this commandment is about, why God has a commandment relating to, or not just why he has a commandment relating to human life, but the nature of the commands, what God obligates us to or forbids us to do, it all hinges around what life is. And that's what we need to talk about first. What is human life? And what's sort of a contrary opinion? Because what we want to do is look at and set side by side two different views of what human life is like. Once you understand what human life is, then what Scripture commands regarding it starts to make sense. Also, if you start understanding what sort of some contrary opinions are regarding human life, then perhaps we can understand a little bit better why society seems to be veering in different directions, because there is something behind all of this. So we're going to begin with the idea of the sanctity of human life. That goes against the concept of human life, which arises out of naturalism. Naturalism is the idea that everything exists according to nature. There's no God riding herd over all of this. The universe is just a huge natural system and has produced us naturally. So naturalism, Darwinianism, which is sort of the specific way that naturalism applies to how you and I got here. But Darwinianism has a lot to say about what human life is, and it's really important that we sort of think about this a little bit. And then humanism, which is really just the moral paradigm that goes along with naturalism and Darwinianism oftentimes. So these are the alternative worldviews regarding human beings, okay? So, sanctity of human life. What does it mean that human life is sacred? People use that all the time. They'll say that. But what does a Christian mean when we say human life is sacred? Because we mean more than just that it's special. The word sacred does what?
Set aside for God, created by God.
Yeah, okay, so if it's sacred, it is sacred by virtue of a connection to God. How is human life connected to God? Okay, we could say he's our creator, but then we could also say that the squirrel is created by God too, but we wouldn't say that squirrels' life are sacred in the same sense that human life is sacred. So how is human life connected to God in a way that squirrels are not? We are all created by God. That's true. The image of God is really important because although Genesis tells us that God created all the different creatures, he singles out human beings for special attention, number one. And number two, we are told that he breathes into them the breath of life and they become a living being. And then it specifically says that God created human beings in his image. So there is a connection between human life and God that does not exist between other life forms, okay? Other life forms are like human life in some regards, but in this particular regard, there is an aspect of human life which is altogether unlike all other life. And that's what makes human life sacred. Now, okay, so the image of God, let's delve into that a little bit further. We bear the image of God. The image of God is getting at not what it is that God looks like, but what it's getting at several things, but one thing is what God's character is like. Okay, so a person ought to be able to look at a human being and gauge from that human being who is in the image of God. They ought to be able to do something or another of the character of God. We should be reflecting the character of God. Now, obviously in this sinful, broken world, human beings do not perfectly reflect the character of God, but as the image of God originally was intended, human beings do reflect the character of God in a way that a squirrel does not. Second thing that the image of God gets at is agency. In other words, we are here on this earth as representatives of God, here to tend the garden, to subdue the earth, to multiply, but we are here as God's representatives. We are representing God in his creation and therefore actually doing God's work. Again, squirrels are not here as a representative of God. They are here to show that what God can do. But human beings are not just here to show what God can do, but are actually here to do for God what other creatures cannot do. So we belong to God in a way that other creatures don't. We represent God in a way that other creatures don't. We are like God in a way that other creatures are not. And therefore, human beings stand in a special class. Okay? Therefore, human life, or the taking of human life, or the flourishing of human life, is simply not in the same category as every other creature on earth. We might consider, for example, what's wrong with cruelty to animals. But what's wrong with cruelty to animals is an altogether different kind of question than what would be wrong with the same kind of cruelty to human beings. Okay? Which is not to say that we can do with animals whatever we want, but the problem with cruelty to animals is simply a different kind of problem. Okay? It actually, in the end, is a human problem. Okay? But human beings are of themselves a thing that we wish to flourish, and we wish to counter the forces in this world that are causing much suffering. Okay, so that God is sacred, that human life is sacred to God. Note, sacred by its sort of definition is sacred to God. Nobody cares if it's sacred to you and me if it's not sacred to God. If it's sacred to God, then it better be sacred to you and me. But if it's sacred to you and me and not to God, it's simply not sacred. We're simply mistaken. So the sanctity of life, the point is, it's sacred to God. This becomes another important thing. To whom does your life belong? Your life belongs to God. I have no right to take your life. You have no right to take my life. You have no right to take your life. I have no right to take my life. My life doesn't belong to me. Your life doesn't belong to you. Our lives belong to God. Since they belong to God, that right away settles a lot of questions that in our culture we wrestle with. Our lives don't belong to us, not only that we live, but what we use our lives for. Because we are here as God's agents, and because we bear his special stamp, and because we are sacred. Okay? Here is a simple sort of illustration of how this sometimes plays out. Some people will say that capital punishment is sort of the opposite of holding human life sacred. Because if human life is sacred, then you don't take it. And capital punishment is a taking of human life, and therefore you are not holding life sacred. What's the counter-argument to that? Sounds like we're not holding life all that sacred if we're taking a life that we think that life shouldn't exist. How do you get around that taking this life is okay, but other lives are not, but life is sacred? How do we justify, if you want to justify, capital punishment on the grounds that life is sacred? Okay? I find prevention and deterrence to be somewhat weak because most murders don't happen when the person is pondering the consequences. They wouldn't do it if they thought that they would get the death penalty, but they will do it if it's only 40 years in prison. That I don't think most people think that way. They don't think at all about the consequences, or they think they're going to escape, okay? But they probably don't draw that distinction between, I don't want the death penalty. You know, the rest of my life in prison, I can handle that. You're going to die. Okay, so how do we square the sanctity of life with killing somebody? Okay. We are honoring life when we execute somebody. How does that work? Okay, it's the life of the person that was taken, not the person being executed, that is at question here. Okay? That's why in Genesis chapter 9 it talks about whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for in the image of God he created him. Okay? So in other words, the death penalty for murder is justified not because the murderer's life isn't sacred, but the victim's life was sacred. Okay? Now, this doesn't answer the question, by the way, as a political matter, whether you ought to favor or not favor capital punishment. That doesn't answer the question because there are other issues involved. But it does help us to understand how it is, because people will try to zing me with this every now and then. You say life is sacred, and then they throw up, but you're probably for capital punishment. And how can you be that way? And the same people that are against abortion are for capital punishment, and they think that they've really got a brilliant argument here. So it's important for us to understand that life is sacred even when you're talking about taking it. And it is especially because it is sacred that there's any discussion of taking it. That's why the Scripture says that if an ox gores a man to death, the ox should be put to death. Well, it's not a punishment for the ox, but it's just appropriate because human life is sacred and this ox killed a human being. Okay? We're not trying to prevent anything, a retributive justice on the poor old ox. It's a statement of the value of human life, which is what we're really talking about here. What makes human life valuable? Now, how we answer that question, what is human life and what makes it valuable, is going to inform a lot of other decisions that we might make. Some people will say, nobody will say this, but it's clear that that's what they're thinking, that some lives are worth more than others. Okay? What would be the criteria if we are going to decide that some lives are worth more than others? Let's just pretend that that's the case. And we're a committee here, and we're going to decide which lives are worth more and which lives are worth less. What criteria shall we use?
Bank balance.
A bank balance? Why would a bank balance be important? It might not sort of automatically. I mean, let's take somebody who's worthless, and then let's put a whole bunch of money in their bank account. They don't suddenly become valuable. Okay, but sort of the assumption is that you've got a lot of money, that you've got a lot of wherewithal to make all that money. Of course, that's not always the case. Some people, it's just, okay. But you are also, if you've got a lot of money, she's capable of doing things. But usually the assumption is if you've got a lot of money, then you made a lot of money. And how did you make a lot of money?
Creating value.
Yeah, being valuable. Okay? Now, this is so tempting in our culture because our culture monetizes almost everything. And we don't even think about it. We just do. Everything has a price. And for the most part, we consider that a good thing because the price is just sort of a neutral. It just has to do with supply and demand and whatnot like that. But sometimes prices can be attached to things that we realize, I don't know that we want to attach a price to that. There's all kinds of things where we get very, very uncomfortable, or other times when the market will attach a value to something that we say, I just don't know that that's that valuable at all. But nevertheless, in our culture, economic worth, which means your ability to do something of economic value, is one way that we do. Does our culture favor people with money when we're talking about the value of their lives? Yeah, we usually don't do this intentionally, although sometimes it's intentional. But look, let's face it, if you're rich, you're more likely to live longer. Why is that?
Better security guards.
Yeah, you have all kinds of benefits to help, right, that the poor don't have. So the poor tend not to live as long, even if you're an otherwise healthy person. I mean, if you want to have a really good medical coverage, it helps to have a lot of money, right? So, and if you're on Medicaid, well, then you take what you get, okay? And somebody might say, well, that doesn't seem very fair, and I don't know anybody who's going to argue that it's fair. It's just the way it is, and we may be unclear about how we can make it better without accidentally making it worse. But okay, so obviously the idea. What are the criteria that might be related to your ability to do things? Yeah. Okay. Well, what sorts of factors can make you more or less able to contribute to society?
Longevity.
Pardon me?
Longevity. How much longer you have.
Okay, all right. Now there's a brutal reality. Okay, we dealt with this all the time in personal injury cases. I mean, what your value is in terms of you get injured or get killed. It's an awful thing, by the way. Wrongful death suits are just an awful, and it's not really the death itself, which is the awful part. That's awful all by itself. It's trying to evaluate how much is this person worth and the kinds of things that you have to look at. Everybody wrinkles up their noses at this. We just don't know what else to do with it. And yet, there is an overt, if you're a doctor and you get run over, or you're a janitor and you get run over, the doctor's going to get a lot more money, assuming there's insurance on the other side. Otherwise, you could get nothing, right? But and that doesn't seem to comport very well with the idea that life is sacred, does it? Because if life is sacred, then what is the basis for the value of a human life? It's connection to God. It's sacredness to God, that your life belongs to God. Now, but from a human point of view, very old people and very young people tend not to be as valuable. Poor people tend not to be as valuable, okay, as wealthy people. People who are capable of things. All right. The sanctity of life would suggest, well, wouldn't really suggest, pretty well demands, that we really don't want to make those kinds of distinctions when we don't absolutely have to. But let's take another idea of human life. I have up here naturalism, Darwinianism, and humanism. Naturalism, as I pointed out, is the philosophy, essentially, that everything has a natural explanation, which means that you can believe in God if you want, but God also has to follow the laws of nature. So God doesn't interfere with nature. God can't interfere with nature. Actually, if you're a thoroughgoing naturalist, because of what I just said, you're going to dispense with God because he isn't necessary. He will even tell you that it is not necessary to believe in God. Why? Because everything has a natural explanation. So we'll get rid of God. Therefore, your life and mine have a natural explanation, not a supernatural explanation. So we can't talk about the sanctity of life because sanctity of life implies that there's a connection to God, and God is a supernatural explanation. And God, as an explanation for human life, is a supernatural explanation. And if you're a naturalist, there is no such thing. So if you are a naturalist, where do human beings come from?
Nature.
Pardon?
Nature.
We come from the same place everything else comes from. What is the difference in a Darwinian point of view? Let me explain Darwinianism just for a moment. Darwinianism isn't the idea that life is evolving to higher and higher stages. Darwinianism doesn't have any sense of evolving up or evolving down or doing anything. It's a series of random acts and adaptations to the environment coupled with survival of the fittest, okay? So when you think about pure Darwinianism, do not think of anything being guided. The idea that animals have claws in order to X is wrong. A good Darwinian would say, no, animals do not have claws in order to claw and grasp their food and eat their food. Okay. It's not a design. Nobody said, this creature has no way to eat. We better give him fangs and claws, then he'll be able to eat. That did not happen. It's just that certain creatures developed certain things, certain appendages in their hands and in their teeth that made it more likely for them to survive. But that was an accident. Okay? Pure Darwinianism, and by the way, that's the only kind of Darwinianism that we should talk about. Either you're a pure Darwinianist or don't bother. Okay? Either God's designed you or there is no design. But somewhere betwixt and between actually makes no sense. So Darwinianism says that you and I are here not because we are evolved to be the highest of species, we just happen to evolve in this direction. Okay? The squirrel happened to evolve in a different direction. But to speak of one being of a higher order than another is a nonsensical statement in a Darwinian point of view. Do you understand what I mean by that? This cuts so hard against our intuition, which says, obviously, most people are more important than squirrels. So, obviously, human beings are higher. But the Darwinian would say, no, that's just, you're being very selfish there. You just prefer yourself. But, reality is, life goes wherever it goes. And it didn't have to go in your direction. There didn't have to be any human beings. So what, in a Darwinian point of view, is special about human life? Well, we could say this is special to us. You could say it's unique, but then there's probably something about being a squirrel that's unique too. They would probably be very proud of being a squirrel. Yeah, look what I can do. You can't do that. Human beings are very, very good at one thing, we might say, from a biological point of view, very good at thinking. But most other functions, you can find some other animal that can see better than us, can run faster than us, smell better than us, right? All the other things. There's really nothing, from a Darwinian point of view, there is nothing unique about human beings or human life. We are here as a product of natural forces, random occurrences, and natural selection. You and I are here because many, 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 many countless other creatures did not survive, and the herd has been culled over and over and over again, and over many, many millennia, the result is us. But we're just an accident. Now, humanism is sort of the moral paradigm that goes along with Darwinianism or naturalism. In other words, we don't want to say human beings are not special at all and everything is random and therefore there's no such thing as good or bad. We need to be able to say some things are good and some things are bad, right? Humanism is a way to try to say what is good and what is bad, given that everything is by random chance and there is no God. And so humanism's answer is that human beings are sort of the focal point or the center of all things, practically speaking. Not really, but since we're human beings and we get to make the rules, then for human beings, Man is the measure of all things. That would be a sort of traditional way of putting it. What is good for human beings is good, and what is bad for human beings is bad. Why? It's good because we say it's good. We get to say, okay? We get to say it's good because you're human beings. Squirrels would have a different attitude. But squirrels aren't here having this conversation, and we are. So if we want to decide what's good or bad, and we want to say what's good for human beings is good, we're allowed to say that. You know why? Because we're human beings, and we get to make the rule. It's just that crass. What else are you going to say? If it's not us making the rules, how are you going to decide that human beings deserve more? Why should we say, I can kill a squirrel, but I can't kill a human being? From an evolutionary point of view, why should I be able to say that?
Because we can.
Well, from a humanist point of view, it's because we're people, and I don't want you to kill me, and so I won't kill you, and we're more important than the squirrels. And why? Is because we say so. Now, you got to, I mean, it's going to be arbitrary like that, because what else are you going to do? Human beings are in charge because we have the power over squirrels. And therefore, we'll make the rules, and the rules will favor human beings and not squirrels. Okay? But there's no sort of objective, overarching thing that would say that that's the case, other than we're making the rules. Overarching, we would say there's really no difference between a squirrel and a human being from a biological point of view, because we're all going to end up just in dust anyway. Okay? So, that's very different than the idea that life is sacred. When we talk about life as sacred, then the value of life does not depend on what you and I say, but what God says. And human beings are relieved of the obligation of trying to figure out why we should live this, why we can kill a squirrel but not another human being. Because human life belongs to God and is sacred to God in a way that a squirrel is not. And that answers it. It doesn't answer it because you and I agree to it. It answers it as a universal, objective truth. Okay? Very different ways of looking at human life. Now, this has implications. The abortion debate is often framed as a matter of the sanctity of life. But consider how readily abortion is able to be defended from a Darwinian point of view. It's not really a problem from a Darwinian point of view. How come? Not just because there's no God to judge.
Because we say so.
Well,
We make the rules.
yeah, but I mean, but we can go further than that. We can
Life
actually...
is not sacred.
Huh?
Life is not sacred.
Life isn't sacred, but not only that, how did you and I end up here? Natural selection. Is that not correct?
Yeah.
Other creatures that were no better than you just happen to be better adapted, or your ancestors did, so that life is here because others were selected away. So that happens in the womb all the time spontaneously, does it not? So what's the difference between a human decision to cull the herd some? Isn't that the same thing? What's different about it? From a Darwinian point of view, there's no reason whatsoever why you would have a problem with culling. Now, of course, this argument goes further than that. The baby in the womb is easy enough to target, but this same logic can go for other things. What about the child who was born and is
Down syndrome.
a Down syndrome child? Take Down syndrome, right? Why do we not euthanize a child who clearly is not going to be well adapted from a Darwinian point of view?
Well, there are societies in the past who have.
Oh, definitely there have been.
And eugenicists in general.
Oh, yes. The whole idea of eugenics is the idea that if we don't kill them, we at least don't let them breed. And of course, the whole idea of what we're not going to allow breed, it sort of depends. Some people we can say, all right, clearly that person is not well adapted. But other people might say, oh, well, there's all kinds of people I consider not well adapted. And if we want to have a master race, then what we need to do is not just call out the weakest. What we need to do is only reproduce the strongest
And most beautiful.
and most beautiful and most desirable and economically most valuable and healthiest. Now, from a Darwinian point of view, what's wrong with any of this? I mean, you're going to have trouble arguing why you shouldn't be able to do this other than it is very unpopular. But from the point of view of the Scripture and the value of life, why there's a commandment that says you shall not murder, this is not a social decision based upon, well, we just don't like that. This is God's own command that says human life belongs to me. It does not belong to you. And therefore you may not touch it. An interesting argument also, that you don't see this in the news much. You don't see it at all. I've never heard of it actually discussed. Which point of view is more amenable to racial prejudice and segregation and such things like that? A Darwinian point of view or a sanctity of life point of view?
Darwinian, for sure.
That's not the popular view, is it?
No.
Who is it that has caused all the racism in the world?
The haters.
The haters, and they use what to do that? We use Christianity to justify this. Of course, what they don't say is it's a very narrow view there, and Christianity was also used much more powerfully to end racial discrimination, not to establish it. But from the point of view of the sanctity of life and that God is the author of all life, what is the justification for one race considering itself superior over another? Zero. From the point of view of Darwinianism, does it make sense to ask the question, have some races evolved to be more adapted, successful, adapted more in certain ways than others? Is that a question that a Darwinian might sensibly ask?
20th century, they did all over the place.
Well, they did, but you're not allowed to talk about it. But understand that that kind of question, is it possible that some races are simply smarter than others? From our Darwinian point of view, why? If some people's skin it tends to be darker, or some people tend to be taller, or some people tend to have more tendency to diabetes, or whatever it happens to be, why not assume that there might be something in our heads that makes some races more intelligent, or more intelligent in some ways and less intelligent in others, or why not like that? That makes perfect sense from our Darwinian point of view, because human beings are products of accident, and we evolve, and it's always a survival fight for survival of the fittest. There is no hand of God ultimately judging the value of human life. And so that if we want to say there shall be no racial prejudice, and you're Darwinian, you're simply saying it.
And that's why they have a diversity clause.
Well, but from the point of view of a Christian, we can say, well, I'm not allowed to exercise that kind of racial prejudice because it flies in the face of what God says a human life is. It is sacred to Him. From a Christian point of view, that to consider and to extol the belief in the brotherhood of all human beings makes perfect sense. But from our Darwinian point of view, we have to understand that some of us are simply better adapted to our environment than others. And if you'd been born 1,000 years ago, many of us would not have lasted, most of us would not have lasted as long as we have now. And that, in a different environment, some of us are going to excel. Some of us are excelling in this environment because we've adopted certain attitudes and so on. But it's all accident. All right. The Christian view of human life requires that we understand the value of human life comes from God. It is not an evolutionary accident. And that human beings are different than animals, not just in number, in quantity, but in quality. We are a different thing by virtue of God. What makes murder so heinous is because we are sacred to God. Even an unbeliever is sacred to God in that sense. Okay? Our culture, to the extent that it is abandoning what had been a long-standing tradition in the Western world to understand that human life is sacred to God, that even unbelievers would at least give lip service to that, and certainly not believe that human beings are just, you can't even really say highly evolved. We would like to say that. But evolved, selected animals. We are not human animals. Now, is there a sense in which we could say, even from a Christian point of view, we are human animals?
Yeah.
Because we do share much with the animals, right? By design. They were made from the dust of the ground, so are we. That God did not breathe into them the breath of life and give them the image of God is the difference. But the fact of the matter is, you can learn a lot about human biology by studying other mammals. So that should give us all a great deal of humility, that there's certain ways in which we really are ashes and dust to dust. Okay, so if life is really sacred, then it follows that God commands that we value human flourishing. Okay? Human flourishing is a good thing. Human suffering is a bad thing. Okay? Simply false. Darwinianism. Does Darwinianism draw a distinction between flourishing and suffering? Does it care?
Social Darwinism does. No. It's basically we should reject suffering because it's good for the species.
Well, but suffering might be excellent for the species.
It's necessary for a small portion of the species.
Suffering's very good for you.
We see suffering as a moral evil because it causes life, which is in the image of God, created by God and sacred to God, it is being diminished. Whereas human flourishing is the opposite idea. It was what Jesus said, I came that you may have life and have it in abundance. Okay? So let's look at it this way. Helping somebody who needs help. Now, some people will say that Christians should do this because it's a good witness. Is it a good witness when Christians help the poor or alleviate suffering?
No argument that it is.
It can very well be a good witness, okay? However, even if it's not a good witness, even if the other person never knows that you did this for Christ's sake, it is a positive good all by itself that we should help. Now think of how much of human life, how much of human existence is spent, how many vocations, how many lives, how much human endeavor and vocations are dedicated to either bringing about human flourishing or mitigating human suffering. I mean, whether we're talking about law or medicine, economics, finance, education, construction, building a road, okay, makes life better, okay? In our culture, we are so rich that we spend a lot of time on very high-end aspects of human flourishing, arts and entertainment and leisure, and we have a lot of time that we can think about these things. But this is a relatively new development. In most of human history, having enough food on the table was considered enough to be really, really thankful for. Being able to fight against disease and pandemics or build houses that don't blow away in hurricanes, all of this are aspects and ways in which we are attempting to meet the spirit, the purpose, the point of the fifth commandment and the honoring that life is sacred. Okay? So you can think in terms of even unbelievers engaged in occupations where they are trying to help other people. How many people, you don't have to be a Christian, and you ask a young person, what do you want to do when you grow up? I don't know, but I want to do something that helps people. How common is that? And that's a very positive thing to want to do. You want to help people, okay? And so that's good. That is a positive good in this world, that we should want to do that. And those things which cause death and suffering and loss and grief are in and of themselves bad. Now, understand, from a Darwinian point of view, this is not true. From our Darwinian point of view, things which cause death make us stronger. It doesn't make you stronger if you die. That's not how it works. But if Darwinianism is working properly, then you suffer and die before you pass on your weak genes. It's a horrible way of looking at life, isn't it? You understand that in our culture, those are the two views of life, the two coherent views, okay? Either we are the product of random chance, or we are the special creation of God in His image. Those are the two competing views. Now, there may be other views out there in the world, but we don't deal with those too much in this country. A lot of people in our culture somehow or another muddle both of these. So they have elements of Darwinianism and elements of theism mixed together in an unholy mix, but they don't realize that. So in some regards, they act as though, they act as though everything is natural, everything is according to nature, and then other times they, for some reason or another, decide that life is sacred.
So I shouldn't post Darwin Awards on my Facebook.
Yes, Darwin Award. You know what a Darwin Award is? It's cruel and macabre, but very funny. Darwin Awards are awards given by people who manage to select themselves out of reproduction by being very stupid. Yeah, it's not going to get you great honor in the world to come, but it can be humorous here now when you find somebody dying of the stupidest thing in the world, and you say, well, the one way the world is better is that person won't pass on their genes. It is humorous, but actually, from a Darwinian point of view, it actually is coherent. Okay, stupid people, reckless people, thoughtless people ought not to reproduce, and except that we human beings tend to coddle these people, they wouldn't. And our race would be stronger if we'd let the weak die. Now, there have been efforts in our 20th century to let the weak die. And you can make some very strong economic arguments that we waste a lot of money in our society keeping old and weak people alive, and we shouldn't. And the powerful argument against that is that life isn't yours, that life belongs to God. That is a coherent argument. It protects us all. And the other, I get very, very nervous with all discussions of euthanasia and death with dignity. I wholeheartedly understand the fear. Who here wants to be in a situation where you are connected to all manner of machines? You are dying, but we won't let you die. You are not conscious. You are not going to be conscious. But all these wonderful whiz-bang machines, and if you have enough money to keep it going, we can keep the shell of your body going for a great long time. Who hasn't entertained the fear, like, I'd rather have anything happen than that? May I just drop over dead? And then somebody will say, we should just be able to end that life.
It makes sense.
Now, let's set that aside for a moment. and recognize that the moment we open the door and say, you should be able to choose the manner and the time of your own death, as though your life belonged to you. And remember, if your life is sacred to God, your life does not belong to you. It belongs to God. The moment we open that door to say that you are, and that's the idea here, you ought to be able to decide the time and the circumstances of your own death. That's what death with dignity means. You get to decide. Now, doesn't that sound good? Like we are honoring you to give you the right to determine the circumstances of your own demise. That sounds good. But if you start thinking about it just a little bit, even aside, and let's just set aside, for example, the idea that, no, God says no. What are we saying to every single human being who, because they're sick, or they're weak, or they're depressed, or they are alone, that the fleeting thought comes by that the world would be better off what? Without them. Some of these people, it's just self-pity. But it's often not self-pity. It is a genuine thought. The world would be better off without me. Oh yeah, this or that person would grieve briefly. They'll get over it. No, they'll probably never thank me, but they will be better off. Now, let's take away the social taboo that has always existed in Christian cultures against killing yourself. Now, how do you stand up against that? If I say, I think that the world would be better off without me, then what are you going to say to me? Oh no, that's not true. Okay. What if you fail to persuade me? What's the point of this argument? The point of this argument is, if I'm right and the world would be better off without me, what should I do? Dispatch myself. But if you're right and the world would not be better off, then what should I do? Go on living. So the whole thing is an argument over whether I ought to go on living, because the question is whether the world would be a better place or not. Does that comport with the sanctity of human life? Not at all. Now let's go back to this other situation that I was talking about. The person that's on life support forever and ever. Okay, we don't need to take an extreme example and let that kind of freakish Frankenstein-type situation govern how we ought to view life. So let this guide you, at least for your general thinking. Life is a gift from God and it belongs to God. Yes? And we Christians, at least, but even if you're not a Christian, we Christians can say even to a non-Christian, your life is valuable and you're valuable to God even if you don't know it. So we should be thankful for our life. That means that we don't say, I don't like my life, or the world would be better off without me. That's not a question that we should ask. My life belongs to God. He'll keep me here as long as He wants me. And if He wants me to be a net negative economically in this world, well, that's the way it is. Lots of people are net negatives in this world economically. So what? So that's the flip side of love, isn't it? Sometimes we need to help people because they can't help themselves. So we should value life, and we should not ask questions like, should I live? Is this worth, am I taking up more space than I'm worth? We should not even approach those questions. Those are not coherent questions for a person who believes that their life is sacred because of God. On the other hand, does a Christian recognize and understand? Do you and I understand that our life in this world is not the sum total of who we are? That we do not, in fact, only go around once. That in reality, we can dishonor God by getting rid of our life because we don't like it. We can also dishonor God by scratching and clawing and holding on to this life no matter what. As though, without this life, I have nothing. Okay? Now, so what we're trying to do is I don't want to say thread the needle, because that sounds like it's a very narrow. It's not. At the very extreme edges, you might have some weird things. Yes, there does come a time when it is entirely appropriate for a human being to say, I am going to do this much to stay alive. I am not going to do that much. It used to be that much didn't exist. There was only so much you could do. You're only going to stay alive so long anyway, and that's that. In our society today, it's still mostly that way, but nevertheless, a larger and larger number of people are falling into a class where actually we can keep you alive for a very long time if you want. Maybe. It's okay for a Christian to say, well, I love the life that God has given me. However, I'm not going to act like this is the only thing that I have, and without this life I have nothing. So I am willing with Jesus to say, into your hands I commit my spirit. That doesn't mean you put a gun to your head. That doesn't mean that you starve yourself to death. That doesn't mean that. So we Christians always are thinking first, what is it that will honor God? And having yourself cryogenically preserved so that science may be able perhaps find a cure for whatever it is that killed you one day, I can tell you, is not honoring God. And saying, I don't care what you have to do. You pull out all the stops, spend whatever has to be, keep my body alive as long as possible, because it's all I have, is not honoring God. Neither is suicide, whether it's dignified or whether it's in an act of despair. And nor should we Christians ever suggest to another human being that they have a right to decide that the world would be better off without them. I don't know how you make that decision. Who are we even to entertain that decision? That is in God's knowledge. And he seems to be quite proficient at knowing when you and he no longer needs us here in this world. He'll take us out in good time. The sanctity of human life means that life belongs to God.
Oh, what about a directive when you come to the end?
Well, okay, and
Where does that fit
sure,
in?
an advance directive it is an act of faithfulness on the. Now, look, if it's an advance directive saying, if I have an ingrown toenail, shoot me through the head. That's not a legal one, of course, but that would not be. But to say that, I realize that I've lived a full life, and my life is, my body is only going to go so long, and I realize that there are ways to keep me going that are not going to be honoring to God, and so I don't want you to do these things. Now, if it turns out, for example, if putting me on a respirator means I'm never going to be taken off again, because we're just delaying the inevitable, to say I don't want that is not, now, that's not an act of dishonoring God or dishonoring life. That's actually, I'll tell you a little bit what it's like. I'm always proud of somebody who says, yes, I've already planned my funeral. It's not a morbid thing to say, here's my hymns. This is the text I want preached on. Preacher, this is what I want you to say. That's an excellent sermon. Thank you very much for that. Look, that's responsible. That's recognizing that you are going to die. And that's not the end of everything. And that we honor God in our life and in our death. And that's what's most important here, is that we honor God in our life and in our death. When you give to people the thought that you can end your life if you want, and a dignified ending of your life is one without pain, or one at the time of your own choosing, is to totally ignore that your life belongs to God. It's just to ignore that. And it's to arrogate unto ourselves that which is not ours. And it has a very pernicious effect. Everybody who is old and depressed or sick and chronically sick or reached the end of their economic viability in life, how are you not going to have those thoughts? They haunt human beings. What if your ongoing ailments you think might cost your children and grandchildren their inheritance? Does that sound crass? Well, I'd like to think that your children would think so. But if you're the one that's thinking it, it might not sound so crass. It might sound like the responsible and decent thing to do. I'll check out, and my kids can take that European vacation after all. You're not going to, look, when you're in that position, those sorts of thoughts will haunt you. What we need to do is to value human life by telling people your life belongs to God. Miserable as it may be at any given moment, it still belongs to God. And He will take you out of this world when He is good and ready, and you and I will wait patiently on Him. We will honor God by living our lives. We will honor God by not scratching and clawing hold of it as though we have nothing else. Okay? All right. So that's the fifth commandment. I've not touched upon all kinds of things. You can go into the Bible verses and look at those and consider some additional aspects of what the commandment means and doesn't mean. Primarily what I want you to understand is the fifth commandment is about the sanctity of life. The human life is sacred to God, and we as Christians should act that way at all times. All right, let's pray. Lord Jesus, thank you for the lives that you've given to us. We thank you especially, Lord, for the everlasting lives that you've given to us. Help us, O Lord, to value the things that you've given to us, to honor you by the way we live, and to honor you by the way we die. Amen.